History remembers kings, empires, and victories, but it forgets the women who paid for them. Tonight, this isn't a story of trade routes or dates on a map. It's the story of what happened after the raid, after the chains, after the silence began. For centuries, African women were captured, sold, and erased, not in secret, but by systems the world accepted as normal, legal, profitable, blessed. This is not modern outrage. This is old history, the kind most people were taught to ignore. Welcome to Dark Chronicler, where forgotten truths are remembered and the past is allowed to speak for itself. It didn't matter where you were born. It didn't matter who your parents were. Once the raid came, your name no longer mattered. In many parts of Africa, a woman's body became property the moment her village fell, not because of crime, not because of choice, but because power decided so. From that moment on, her life followed a pattern repeated thousands of times across centuries. Captured, stripped of identity, assigned a new purpose. She could be sold. She could be gifted. She could be kept. Freedom was not something she lost later. It was something she was never expected to have again. And the most disturbing part is this. This system didn't see her as a victim. It saw her as useful. Her labor, her body, her ability to produce children, all measured, all owned. History often describes these events with neutral words: trade, custom, tradition. But for the women inside that system, the reality was simpler. They didn't belong to an empire. They didn't belong to a household. They didn't even belong to history. They belonged to whoever held them last. The raid always followed the same logic: fast, violent, final. Men who resisted were cut down where they stood. Older men were executed. Boys were killed before they could become threats, not out of cruelty alone, but efficiency. The attackers knew exactly what they were looking for: women, young enough to survive the journey, strong enough to work, valuable enough to keep alive. What followed was not chaos. It was selection. Some women were tied together, others were separated immediately. Mothers watched their children dragged away in different directions, knowing they would never see them again. Death, in many cases, would have been quicker, because survival meant something else entirely. It meant marching for days under guard. It meant being inspected like livestock. It meant learning very quickly that resistance only changed the method, not the outcome. For the men who died in those raids, the story ended that day. For the women who survived, the story was just beginning, and it would be written by whoever owned them next. The raid was only the beginning. What came next lasted far longer. Once the noise ended and the village was gone, the women who survived entered a different kind of violence. There were no battles anymore, no chaos, no witnesses, just waiting, held in enclosures, tied in groups, guarded day and night. This was the moment when hope disappeared. Escape was no longer about distance. It was about endurance. Days passed without explanation, without names, without any sense of where they were going. Some were taken away and never returned. Others learned quickly that asking questions only made things worse. This is where slavery truly began, not with chains, but with uncertainty. Because once a person understands that their future is no longer theirs to imagine, something breaks that never fully heals. History often focuses on capture, on ships, on markets, but the real transformation happened here in the silence after the raid, when survival stopped meaning freedom and started meaning submission. Prisoners are kept for negotiation, for exchange, for ransom. These women were kept for possession. After the raid, they weren't counted as survivors. They were counted as rewards, given to warriors for loyalty, presented to leaders as symbols of victory, sold to finance the next campaign. Their value wasn't in who they were, but in what could be taken from them. Some were marked immediately, claimed before the march even ended. Others were inspected later, silently ranked by age, strength, and appearance. This wasn't disorder, it was protocol. Being chosen didn't mean protection. It meant permanent ownership. A prize could be traded, a prize could be replaced, a prize could be discarded. And the system never pretended otherwise. No trial, no sentence, no end date. Once labeled a reward, a woman stopped being part of the war's aftermath and became part of its economy. History rarely records these moments. It prefers generals and outcomes. But for the women taken alive, this was the moment everything became irreversible. They weren't captured by accident. They were taken on purpose. Maps make it look clean. Lines across deserts, arrows pointing toward ports and cities. On paper, it's commerce. In reality, those routes were made of bodies. Women walked them in chains, sometimes for weeks, sometimes for months. Barefoot, malnourished, guarded by men who knew exactly how far they could be pushed before collapse. If someone fell behind, the caravan didn't stop. Not because it was cruel, but because stopping was inefficient. Pregnant women kept walking. Girls too young to understand where they were going kept walking. Those who couldn't were left where they fell. The route didn't care. Each stop along the way meant another inspection, another negotiation, another reminder that they were moving goods, not people. And this is why history prefers maps. Because routes can be measured, dates can be memorized, numbers can be debated, but the women on those routes had no statistics, no names, no graves, no records, just a direction, and the certainty that wherever the route ended, their lives as they knew them were already over. This part makes people uncomfortable because it doesn't fit a simple story. Long before European ships appeared on the coast, systems of slavery already existed inside Africa. Captured in wars between kingdoms, taken during raids between rival groups, sold through regional markets that had existed for generations. For women, the outcome was often the same. They weren't chained to fields alone. They were absorbed into households, used for labor, used for sex, used to produce children who would never be fully free. This wasn't chaos. It was tradition. Customs passed down, rules enforced, roles understood by everyone involved. That's why the system survived so long. When foreign traders arrived, they didn't invent it. They expanded it. They industrialized it. They turned something local into something massive. And African women paid the price twice. First, through capture by their own region's wars. Then, through export into empires far beyond their world. History often wants a single villain, but reality is older, messier, and far more disturbing. Because once a system like this exists, it doesn't disappear when new powers arrive. It adapts, and the women inside it remain trapped, no matter whose flag is flying overhead. Once a woman entered the system, her body stopped being her own in every possible sense. It had a price, it had a function, it had an expected return. Age increased or reduced value. Scars lowered it. Pregnancy could raise it or destroy it. She could be exchanged to settle a debt, given as a gift to secure loyalty, taken away as punishment when someone else failed. Her suffering wasn't accidental. It was built into the system. Obedience increased survival. Resistance increased pain. This wasn't hatred, it was accounting. Every decision revolved around usefulness. How much labor could be extracted, how much control could be enforced, how long the body would last. That's what makes this so difficult to face. Cruelty implies emotion. This system didn't need it. It functioned perfectly well without anger, without rage, without passion. Just rules, custom, and silence. And once a human being becomes a unit of value, there is no place left for mercy. There were rules, contracts, markets that operated in plain sight. This wasn't done in the shadows. Slavery was regulated. Ownership was recognized. Women were classified, priced, and transferred according to accepted norms. No secrecy was required because no one in power questioned it. Religious texts were cited, customs were invoked, law provided structure. As long as the rules were followed, everything that happened inside the system was considered legitimate. A woman could be owned without shame, used without consequence, disposed of without record. And the most disturbing part is this: the system saw itself as orderly. Violence wasn't excess, it was maintenance. Suffering wasn't failure, it was expected loss. This is why it lasted for centuries. Because when exploitation is written into law, it stops looking like cruelty and starts looking like tradition. And tradition, once established, is far harder to break than chains. War created captives. Religion explained why it was allowed. Commerce decided where they would end up. Each part needed the others. Without war, there were no bodies. Without belief, there was no justification. Without trade, there was no profit. Together, they formed something far stronger than violence alone, a system that didn't need to be questioned. Women taken in raids were reclassified, no longer neighbors, no longer kin, no longer human in the full sense. They became permitted to be owned, permitted to be used, permitted to disappear without consequence. This agreement wasn't written in one place. It didn't need to be. Everyone involved understood their role. The warrior delivered the captive. The merchant assigned value. The authority declared it lawful. And the woman at the center of it all had no voice in any of it. That's how disposability works. Not through chaos, but through consensus. And once an entire society agrees that someone is expendable, no single act of cruelty even stands out anymore. It just blends into daily life. For many women, survival came with a condition. Their bodies were no longer valued only for labor, but for what they could produce. Pregnancy was not protection, it was expectation. Some were selected specifically to bear children, not families, not futures, just replacements. Children born into this system rarely belonged to their mothers. They belonged to whoever owned them next. A woman could give birth and never hold the child again. If she was strong, she was kept. If she aged, weakened, or resisted, she was traded. If she could no longer produce, she disappeared. No record, no ceremony, no memory. This is the part history avoids, because it turned slavery from exploitation into something colder, a system that planned generations in advance while denying humanity in the present. Some women lived long enough to see their children sold away. Others died before understanding why their survival had ended. Either way, the result was the same. They were allowed to exist only as long as they were useful. And when usefulness ended, so did their place in the world. History is selective. When suffering happens close to home, it is recorded, named, memorialized. Victims are given faces, stories are preserved, guilt is debated for generations. But when the victims were African women, history chose silence. No statues, no lists of names, no anniversaries. Millions lived and died without leaving a trace in the record, not because the evidence was missing, but because no one in power felt responsible for remembering them. Their pain didn't fit the narratives that survived. It didn't build nations people still celebrate. It didn't produce heroes. It didn't end with redemption. So it was ignored, and that silence became part of the system, because forgetting is easier than admitting that entire civilizations functioned normally while treating these women as disposable. If the same scale of suffering had unfolded in Europe, it would define centuries of identity. But for these women, history decided anonymity was enough. And that choice tells us as much about the past as the violence itself. People like to believe this kind of suffering was rare, an anomaly, a dark chapter that appeared briefly and disappeared. It wasn't. For centuries, this system operated as background noise, not during crises, not during collapse, but during ordinary life. Markets opened, families formed, empires expanded, and alongside all of it, women were owned, traded, and used as if it were unremarkable. This wasn't a moment when humanity failed. It was a period when humanity adjusted. Children grew up seeing it as normal. Leaders inherited systems already in place. No one asked when it started, only how to manage it. That's what makes it so disturbing, because when something lasts long enough, it stops being seen as violence and starts being seen as tradition. And traditions don't feel cruel to the people who benefit from them. They feel familiar, necessary, unquestioned. So no, this wasn't history at its worst. It was history as usual. And that is far harder to confront. Not every woman was kept in irons. Not every captive was beaten in public. Many lived inside homes, cooked meals, raised children that were not their own. From the outside, it could look almost normal. That was the illusion. Because control doesn't always need metal. It can be enforced through dependency, through isolation, through the quiet certainty that escape is impossible. These women learned the rules quickly, where they could walk, who they could speak to, when silence was safer than words. No locks were needed when obedience had already been taught. This kind of captivity leaves no dramatic scars for historians to point to, no broken chains to display in museums. But it destroys something deeper. When a person no longer imagines freedom, the system has succeeded completely. And that is why these chains were so effective. They were invisible, they were inherited, and they lasted far longer than iron ever could. For some women, motherhood was supposed to change everything. It didn't. Giving birth did not grant protection. It did not secure freedom. It did not create rights. A woman could carry a child for 9 months and lose them in a single moment. Children born from these unions often inherited status, but rarely inherited mercy. Some were absorbed into households, others were sold while still young. Many were taken from their mothers before memory could form. And the mother stayed, watching the system continue with her own blood inside it. This was the final cruelty, not just the use of her body, but the use of her future. Even when a woman survived for decades, even when she outlived her owner, freedom was never guaranteed, because the system did not recognize motherhood as humanity. It recognized only ownership. And once that line was drawn, nothing, not birth, not time, not loyalty, was enough to erase it. It's not the violence, not the chains, not even the scale. It's how ordinary all of this became. These women weren't hidden away from society. They lived inside it, worked inside it, raised children inside it. Their suffering didn't disrupt daily life. It supported it. Entire economies functioned normally while relying on their captivity. People married, prayed, celebrated births and victories. And at the same time, women were being bought, used, and discarded as part of the background. No alarms, no sense of crisis. That's the part history struggles with, because it forces a question with no comfortable answer. How much cruelty can exist before a society stops noticing it? And once something becomes invisible, ending it requires more than laws. It requires breaking habits, beliefs, and traditions people no longer question. This is where the story stops being distant, because this is the moment when the past starts to look uncomfortably familiar. It's comforting to believe this belongs to the distant past, to castles, to caravans, to a world we no longer recognize, but the system didn't vanish. It changed its language, its borders, its justifications. In modern conflicts, women are still captured, still traded, still kept as property under new names, not called slaves, called wives, spoils, dependents. Wars came and went, empires collapsed, flags changed. But in the chaos left behind, the same logic returned. Power takes, silence protects, and women pay the price. This is why the story matters. Because when history is treated as finished, its patterns are free to repeat. And the most dangerous lie we tell ourselves is that time alone makes people better. It doesn't. Only memory does. Abolition sounds final, clean, moral. A date on a timeline where everything is supposed to change. But for many women, nothing did. The chains were removed on paper, not from daily life. Former owners became employers. Captivity became dependency. Control simply changed its name. Women who had no land, no family, no protection were declared free in a world that offered them nothing else. Some remained in the same households, doing the same work, under the same authority. Only now, their suffering was no longer illegal. It was invisible. This is the part abolition stories leave out, because freedom without power is just exposure. And when a system lasts for centuries, it doesn't collapse when a law is signed. It survives in habits, in expectations, in who is believed and who is ignored. So yes, slavery was abolished, but for many women, the life it created never truly ended. Not officially, not on paper, but in reality, in remote regions, in war zones, in places where law never fully arrived. Women are still taken, still controlled, still forced to serve under different names, not called slaves, but the result is the same. No freedom of movement, no consent, no exit. What changed was visibility. The world learned how to look away more efficiently. Old systems didn't disappear. They fragmented, they adapted, they hid behind poverty, behind instability, behind indifference. And that's the final discomfort. This story doesn't end with villains defeated or justice delivered. It ends with continuity, with the knowledge that history isn't just something that happened, it's something that keeps happening when it's forgotten. That's why these stories matter, not to accuse the present, not to rewrite the past, but to remember the people who were never allowed to be remembered. Because silence was always the last chain. If these stories matter, don't let them disappear again. Subscribe to Dark Chronicler and tell us in the comments which forgotten chapter of history should be told next.